let's step into the 14th century, a time when two great movements shaped English society and literature. Politically, the age reached its culmination under Edward III. His victories in the 100 Years' War stirred a powerful sense of English national spirit. Socially, however, the Black Death devastated the population, sparking unrest, peasant revolts, and a rising demand for both equality and reform. Out of this turbulence emerged a spirit of critical inquiry and the seeds of religious change. Now, pause here and recall who are the 5 most important writers of this age. This is a classic exam question. The answer is Langland, Wyclif, Gower, Mandeville, and Chaucer. All of these have been asked in exam. Langland gave voice to social discontent, preaching equality and the dignity of labor. Wyclif, the religious reformer, translated the Bible into English and championed religious freedom. Gower, the cautious scholar, reflected on the age's turbulent energy. Mandeville, the traveller, fascinated readers with tales of wonders abroad. And towering above them all stands Chaucer, the central literary figure, whose works mirrored the life and spirit of the times. Outside England, powerful influences were at work too. The great Italian trio Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio reshaped European literature and left a lasting imprint on English writers. Let's turn to the literary features of the age. First, the standardizing of English. The transition period was almost complete. The East Midland dialect emerged as the foundation of standard English, blending French and English into a new literary language. Chaucer was the first to give this new English its fullest artistic expression. Second, the emergence of a modern spirit. The age shifted away from romantic ideals toward a more critical, dramatic outlook. For the first time, authors were moving away from anonymity. Writers were now naming themselves. And here again, Chaucer stands out as the great representative of this new consciousness. Third, the development of prose. With works like Mandeville's Travels and Malory's Les Mortes d'Arthur, English prose began to establish its style. Latin and French influence was declining, and the English language was maturing into a full medium for both poetry and prose. Finally, let's not forget Scottish literature. Writers like John Barbour, who died in 1395, signaled Scotland's first major literary contributions, enriching the broader tapestry of British literature. So, the 14th century marks a true turning point. Politically assertive, socially restless, linguistically transformative, and above all, the century of Chaucer, who gave English literature its first great voice. Let's turn to Geoffrey Chaucer, often called the father of English poetry. His birth date is uncertain, but scholars generally accept around 1340 in London. In 1357, we find him already in royal service, attached to the household of the wife of the Duke of Clarence. Chaucer's life wasn't confined to poetry. He was a soldier, diplomat, and courtier. He even took part in the 100 Years' War, was captured at the siege of Reims, and ransomed personally by the king. Later, he travelled on diplomatic missions, most famously to Italy in 1378. That Italian journey exposed him to Boccaccio, Dante, and Petrarch, an influence that would deeply shape his writing. Now, for exam, recall, his literary career is divided into 3 periods, and this has been asked in exam. First period, his youth, dominated by French models. Second period, the Italian influence, reflecting his travels and diplomatic career. Third period, the great English phase when his identity and genius crystallized, giving us the Canterbury Tales. Chaucer also had powerful patrons. He was closely aligned with John of Gaunt, and his fortunes rose and fell with politics. On the personal side, he married Philippa Roet, the sister of John of Gaunt's wife. At times, money was tight. His poem, Complaint to His Empty Purse, is a witty plea for financial aid. He died in 1400 and was buried in Westminster Abbey, becoming the very first poet in what is now called Poets' Corner, a symbolic beginning for English literary tradition itself. So, when revising Chaucer, hold on to these anchors. The 3 literary periods, as I told you, this has been asked in exam. his diplomatic Italian mission in 1378, and his final resting place as the first poet buried in Poets' Corner. When we talk about Geoffrey Chaucer, we usually divide his writings into 3 periods, though assigning exact dates is tricky. Still, what matters most is not just when he wrote, but how his works shaped the very foundation of English poetry. Let's hear what later critics said about him. Matthew Arnold, for instance, had immense admiration for Chaucer. He called him the father of splendid English poetry, praising the largeness, freedom, and kindness of his verse. According to Arnold, Chaucer established romantic poetry in England. Yet, and here comes the exam anchor, Arnold also delivered a surprise critique. He claimed that Chaucer was not a classic because he lacked what Arnold called high seriousness, and this has been asked in exam. For Arnold, poets like Homer, Shakespeare, and Milton embodied that moral weight and grandeur which Chaucer did not quite achieve. Now contrast this with Virginia Woolf. In her essay The Learning Tower, she described Chaucer's unique social position. She observed, all writers since Chaucer have come from the middle class, have had good, at least expensive education. This particular commentary was asked in exam. Woolf saw Chaucer as a turning point where literary production shifted from aristocratic patronage to a more educated middle class tradition. So when you revise Chaucer, keep these critical voices in mind. Matthew Arnold praising his charm, yet denying him the status of a classic because of lacking high seriousness. Virginia Woolf highlighting his role in shaping the middle-class literary lineage of English literature. Together, these perspectives remind us that Chaucer was not only a poet of his age, but also a cultural ancestor, influencing how later generations understood the very identity of English writers. Let's begin with Geoffrey Chaucer's first period, when his poetry was shaped deeply by French models. One of his earliest works is the Roman of the Rose, a translation from the French allegorical poem Roman de la Rose. The theme here is love, with the rose symbolizing the lady beauty. But note carefully, only about the first 1700 lines are believed to be Chaucer's own. And here's a direct exam anchor. Chaucer's translation was praised by the French poet Eustache Deschamps. This was recently asked in exam. Another important work is the Book of the Duchess, originally titled Death of Blanche the Duchess. Chaucer wrote it as an elegy after the death of Blanche, the wife of John of Gaunt. It was once asked in exam. It's remembered for its emotional depth and early display of Chaucer's dramatic power. We also find his graceful love lyric, Complaint to Pete, and his devotional poem, ABC, a prayer to the Virgin. This poem was translated from French, and each stanza begins with a successive letter of the alphabet, an acrostic form. Besides these, Chaucer experimented with ballads, roundels, and virelays, short imitations of French love ditties that were fashionable in his age. So, to sum up this first period, Chaucer is still learning from France, translating, imitating, and experimenting, but already showing sparks of his future genius. Keep in mind those anchors, Eustache Deschamps praising his Roman of the Rose, and the Book of the Duchess written for John of Gaunt's wife Blanche. Both are exam favorites. Now let's step into Chaucer's second creative period, where Italian influence shaped some of his finest works. The first is Troilus and Chryseid, a long narrative poem of about 8,000 lines. Its source is Boccaccio's Il Filostrato. This was asked in exam. The story follows Troilus, a Trojan prince, who falls deeply in love with Chryseid, helped by her uncle Pandarus. Their love blossoms, but tragedy strikes when Chryseid is exchanged into the Greek camp and ultimately betrays Troilus. He later dies in battle, and the narrator ends by reflecting on the fleeting nature of earthly joys. The themes are love, betrayal, and the transience of happiness. This poem was admired by later critics. In an apology for poetry, Philip Sidney famously remarked, Chaucer undoubtedly did excellently in his Troilus and Cressida, either that he in that misty time could see so clearly, or that we in this clear age walk so stumblingly after him. and this commentary too asked in exam. This is one of the strongest proofs of Chaucer's critical legacy. Next is the House of Fame. This was recently asked in exam, an unfinished dream vision poem. In it, the poet is carried by an eagle to the mythical House of Fame, where all rumors and stories converge. The work combines lofty allegory with homely language, drawing inspiration from Dante, Ovid, and Virgil. Then we have The Legend of Good Women, another dream vision poem. In its prologue, Chaucer is visited by the god of love and Alcestis, who command him to atone for his earlier portrayals of women by writing about women faithful in love. He responds with 9 legends, though the work remains incomplete. Among these, Thisbe is especially notable. Other figures include Cleopatra, Dido, Hypsipyle, Medea, and Lucretia, each embodying love, loyalty, or tragic betrayal. Across these works, a few themes stand out. First, the Italian influence is unmistakable, showing Chaucer's engagement with Boccaccio and classical models. Second, his stories reflect moral reflections, love, betrayal, and the brevity of happiness. And third, this is the period where Chaucer begins to move beyond French influence towards a more independent English literary voice. Now we arrive at Geoffrey Chaucer's third period, the phase of his career where he produced his masterpiece, The Canterbury Tales. This work is not just Chaucer's greatest achievement, but also one of the most celebrated texts in world literature. The concept is simple but powerful. 29 pilgrims, drawn from across the spectrum of English society, set out on a pilgrimage to Canterbury. Along the way, each pilgrim was supposed to tell 2 tales on the outward journey and 2 on the return, for a total of 120 stories. But here's the exam anchor: Chaucer completed only 24 tales, with some left in fragments. Still, what survives is a rich blend of humor, pathos, vivid description, and sharp social commentary. The tales are connected through prologues and dialogues, creating a lively storytelling contest. Most of them are written in heroic couplets, that is, decasyllabic rhyming lines, and about heroic couplet was asked in exam. Importantly, Chaucer's use of the decasyllabic couplet laid the foundation for the later heroic couplet, which would dominate English poetry in the hands of Dryden and Pope. That's another exam anchor. 10-syllable lines that rhyme, again it was asked in exam. Chaucer also pioneered the regular use of iambic pentameter, a metrical pattern that would become the heartbeat of English poetry and reach perfection in Shakespeare. Besides the Canterbury Tales, Chaucer's short poems from this period are worth noting. The lack of steadfastness reflects on the instability of human life. In Complaint of Chaucer to his purse, he humorously appeals to the king for money, mixing satire with personal complaint. But not all poems once attributed to him were truly his. The Flower and the Leaf and the Court of Love were long thought to be Chaucer's, but modern scholarship has confirmed they are not. Some works, like Origenes upon the Magdalene, are unfortunately lost. Chaucer's legacy lies not only in his individual works, but in his decision to write in the English vernacular at a time when most serious literature was written in Latin or Anglo-Norman French. For this reason, he is rightly called the father of English literature. He gave English poetry a form, a rhythm, and a voice that transformed it into a literary language of dignity and power. So, when you think of Chaucer's third period, remember 3 anchors. The Canterbury Tales as his masterpiece, though unfinished. The decasyllabic couplet leading to the heroic couplet. As I mentioned before, it was asked in exam. His role as the father of English literature for elevating English to a literary standard. When we think of Geoffrey Chaucer, we often remember him as the father of English poetry. But let's not forget he also wrote prose. 2 of his most noted prose tales are The Tale of Melibos and The Parson's Tale, both marked by heavy moralizing, sometimes tedious, yet showing clear improvement in vocabulary and sentence construction. And here's a quick exam anchor. The Tale of Melibos and The Parson's Tale are Chaucer's prose works, and this also had been asked in exam. Beyond these, Chaucer also translated Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy and even wrote a scientific treatise on the astrolabe for his son Lewis. Now, turning to Chaucer the poet, this is where his genius shines. He occupies a unique position in English literature, unmatched in his time and setting the stage for writers who followed. One of his greatest strengths was his keen observation of human nature. He captured manners, settings, and personalities with such precision that his characters still feel alive today. Think of the pilgrims in the Canterbury Tales. Their descriptions are vivid, colorful, and unforgettable. Chaucer's descriptive skill was lively and engaging, often blending humor with detail. His humor ranged from gentle and patronizing to sharp satire, but always with a tolerant and worldly outlook on human weakness. At the same time, his pathos, though less frequent, is deeply humane and sincere, shining through in works like The Prioress's Tale and The Legend of Good Women. Narratively, Chaucer had the gift of momentum. Yes, he could be prolix, even complex, but his stories often move with stealthy speed and vivacity, as in Troilus and Cressida or The Knight's Tale. And then there is his metrical skill. Chaucer refined English verse, strengthening both the octosyllabic couplet and the heroic couplet, giving them a new melody and rhythm. This contribution shaped the very foundation of English poetic technique. Chaucer is regarded as the earliest of the great moderns in English literature. His humanity, his humor, his descriptive and narrative power, and his metrical innovations all mark a decisive leap forward. He transformed ordinary material into extraordinary literature and set the high standard that later poets from Spenser to Shakespeare would inherit.